Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak here today about the case of Julian Assange. Julian Assange is indeed just in his 5th year of detention in Belmarsh high security prison. He isn't convicted in this country of any crime. He isn't even charged in this country with any crime. He's awaiting the outcome of an extradition case being brought by the United States in the courts in this country. And that case is now in its final decision-making moment. It's on a knife edge. It could be that the hearing that we've just had a couple of weeks ago, a 2-day hearing in the High Courts of Justice, that the judges will decide that he should be granted a full appeal, in which case he will be in Belmarsh for another 1 or 2 years while that takes place. But it is equally, perhaps given the court's records up to this point, more likely that he will be extradited almost immediately. The judges give their decision, taken to a military airport in this country, flown to the United States, and put in a high security prison while he awaits trial in the US. Now, he hasn't actually had a full hearing of this case in any senior court in this country. I've asked lawyers time and time again why this is the case. No lawyer has been able to tell me, but the only court before which Julian Assange has appeared in a full trial is a magistrates court. Now, if you're not familiar with the legal system in this country, a magistrates court is where you go if you have a parking fine or a speeding ticket that you're contesting. It's not usually where, I think by common consent, one of the most important freedom of the press cases of the 21st century should be heard, or should be heard only in that court. So it will only be the case that if the judges grant a full appeal in front of the High Court, that his case will be heard in full in a senior court in this country. And although it's taken so long, and the road to this point has been incredibly winding, the issue at the center of this case is very, very simple. What the United States want to do, if they get him to the United States, is to put him on trial under the 1917 Espionage Act in the United States. It will be the first time ever that a journalist has been tried under an Espionage Act in the US. It will be the first time, therefore, ever that a journalist who's not an American has been charged, and who wasn't in America when the material that the United States object to was released. And that material was the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the files which revealed to us what was happening inside a Guantanamo Bay. So what would happen if he were taken to the United States and if he were convicted successfully under the Espionage Act was that the United States had managed to extend extraterritorially the reach of their spy legislation to journalists. Once that precedent is set, any journalist of any nationality in any part of the globe could be, as Julian Assange would already have been, extradited and tried as a spy. Now, this is the deliberate policy of the United States. The then director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, described WikiLeaks, the organization which Julian Assange founded, as a hostile, non-state intelligence agency. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. A hostile, non-state intelligence agency. It's a clear attempt, as is the prosecution under the Espionage Act, to redefine certain sorts of investigative journalism as spying. But fairly obviously, it isn't. Spies secretly take information from one state, give that information secretly to another state, so that the second state will have some kind of military, political, economic advantage over the first state. But Julian Assange took nothing in secret, did not hand it to a competitor state of America. He published it openly, and the material was published in some of the most famous publications in the world. In The Guardian, in the New York Post, in Le Monde, in Der Spiegel. Those were the El País in Spain. Those were the media partners for the release of that material. And it's for that reason that for a long time the United States held back from attempting to prosecute Assange, because the Obama administration said there's what they called the New York Times problem. If we prosecute Assange, then logically we would have to prosecute every single major news outlet which printed the material which he released. And they were reluctant to go there. Not so the Trump administration, who started this, and the Biden administration, who have continued to do exactly this. So this, as practically every human rights organization on the planet, from Amnesty International through Human Rights Watch, through the American Civil Liberties Union, to Reporters Without Borders, practically every journalist organization in the world, including my union, the National Union of Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, the Australian Journalists Union, have said if this goes ahead, there will be a chilling effect, at the very least, on any investigative journalist who receives material which the governments of the world don't believe should be in the public domain. And if you think about that, that is a very, very profound attack on freedom of the press. Because when it comes right down to it, there are only two sorts of news. There are government and corporate handouts, and there is material that they don't want you to know. Nearly everything that you read in the press or hear in the media comes from those two sources. It's either something that politicians and governments want you to hear and have released, or it's something that they don't want you to hear. Now, if you want a news cycle, and I'd say we're too close to having a news cycle which is composed just of that first sort of news, but if you want to have just that sort of news in the news cycle and not the other sort of news, then we're heading down that road with the case of Julian Assange. And remember, some of the things that were released by Assange were absolutely and indisputably in the public interest. Famously in the Iraq War, the US and allied forces, including this country, did not even count the war dead. That was left to voluntary organizations. Julian Assange, through the material that WikiLeaks released, found out that there were an additional 15,000 deaths in Iraq than were on the public record. Now, surely, for every citizen of any country that went to war, that sent its citizens to kill and be killed in Iraq, that spent untold billions of pounds on that war, surely it must be in the public interest to know the most basic fact about war: how many people lost their lives. Neither would we know without the WikiLeaks releases. We would not have seen, perhaps some of you have seen it, if you haven't seen it, actually if you have seen it or if you haven't seen it, it remains one of the most chilling pieces of video to ever emerge from a war zone, the so-called Collateral murder video, which is a cockpit video from an American Apache helicopter as it shoots dead Iraqi civilians and two Reuters journalists, unarmed civilians and unarmed journalists in the streets of Iraq. Now, these are indisputably things which it is in the public interest to know, and it is precisely for those reasons that the United States is trying to send a message, not just to Julian Assange, not just to WikiLeaks, but to every journalist reporting on wars, on imprisonment proceedings, on the secrets of government more generally. Now, there's also, if I've got time, there's a couple of things that I'd Dyke's talked about that have happened in the course of the 5 years that these hearings have been in the British courts. And I would say that in most cases, most legal cases, if any one of these things had happened, the court would have dismissed the case instantaneously. The first is this, that the primary prosecution witness, a former employee of WikiLeaks, testified after the hearing that he'd perjured himself, that he had lied in court, that the things he'd said were not true. That normally would get a case dismissed. He wasn't just a marginal witness, he was the key US government witness in the case. The second thing that's happened is that it's been proved in a separate case in front of Spanish courts that while Julian Assange was claiming political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, the security firm which the Ecuadorian embassy had employed to protect him had been suborned by the Central Intelligence Agency and was providing the CIA with video and audio footage of Assange speaking to his friends, his family, and critically to his lawyers. In other words, there was a gross breach of attorney-client privilege taking place inside the embassy and being relayed directly to the CIA. Now that, by the way, is spying. And it would normally have a case dismissed, but not in this case. And the third thing is this, that it was revealed by an investigative journalist team at Yahoo News and reported very widely throughout the press that while Mike Pompeo was head of the CIA, it developed a plan to either kidnap or to assassinate Julian Assange while he was here in London. The plans got so far that they began consulting with the security services in this country, whose only objection, I have to tell you, was that if any shooting was going to take place in Britain, they'd be the people doing the shooting and not the Americans, which is a reassuring moment of patriotism, I'm sure you'll all agree. Now, if any one of those things, a leading witness perjures themselves, the defendant is spied on by the government that's bringing the prosecution, there's an assassination attempt or a kidnap attempt being developed by the government bringing the prosecution, any one of those, you would think the judges would throw it out. But it shows what an intensely political case this is, that has never happened, never been questioned in a British court, and won't be questioned in a British court unless there's a full appeal hearing now. So, just in summary, this is one of the most high-profile freedom of speech and freedom of press cases that I can remember, going back perhaps to the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg. It is an absolutely extraordinary case in which the politics of it matter more than the facts of the case or the legalities of the prosecution. And the impact of it will be to scare and frighten journalists and whistleblowers from telling you things that should be in the public domain but will not be unless this kind of prosecution is defeated. And the final point I want to make really is, I'm sure you must all be aware, the Assange case is not an isolated attack on the freedom of speech or indeed on the associated freedom of assembly. This is a government in this country which is bringing in new laws to make what are already the most restrictive anti-trade union laws in Europe worse than they already are. It is a government which only this week is bringing renewed legislation and renewed regulations to try and make it harder to say in public oppositional things about the government. They are trying to make a regulation, as you now know, to say that it is going to be regarded as a sufficient condition for the government to break off relations with you as an organisation if you question British parliamentary democracy. Now, I guess they say British because, as you'll be aware, Britain is a constitutional monarchy. So perhaps even if you don't like the royal family, if you ever get to see one of them these days, you won't be allowed a freedom of speech. Now, these are darkening times. And in that context, campaigning for the freedom of Julian Assange is one, but a crucial front in all our ability to practice freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Thank you very much.